So now I've got my blue world here. So let's go ahead and build on top of it. So I'm going to pick out, I got the light wash, which is more or less the sky value. It's close to the sky value. I'm really setting things up for that little white sun in the fog, that white light in there. Maybe it's a UFO. We're going to assume it's a sun. And now I'm going to build darker from that. So when I key a painting, when I figure out the values in a painting, I want to look to what the lightest thing is. And let's just even put it in there. I want it the lightest thing to pop out as it should pop out. So notice I can make it glow even by coming over. I wiped off my brush, loaded it with water, cleaned that off, and then that clean wet brush I went around the outside as you saw, and that softened that edge and set that down. So I want everything to be dark enough that that lightest part of the painting pops off the way it should. And likewise, I want this light enough so that when I put my darker accents, they pop or read as they should. So now I'm going to go with blue again, because it's a blue world. I'm going to add a little bit of red. I'm going to add the blue red so that's nice and intense. Or I'm going to take my blue, add a little bit of water to it. Notice I just barely tipped the brush in, then can do a little bit more. And I'm going to add my warm red, my yellow red, because that's going to make a purple that's dirtier. And I don't want it to be so candy color maybe. And notice where I'm coming. I'm going on the edges of these so I don't pollute the whole color. So if I need to make an orange out of that red, I can come from the other side, get the orange, and the blue stays over here. And then that's awful dark, so I'm going to add a little bit of white. Now this is where the watercolorists would go like that. Watercolorists, the purists, say you'd never use white. You start with a white paper and you just go from the white paper, that becomes your highlights. You do a light yellow wash over it, so it's a yellow-white highlight maybe, and then you add washes and washes and washes that take it darker and darker and darker. But this is kind of abusing that concept, and we're painting half like watercolor artists. This was all watercolor technique, and then as soon as I did that white, now I'm using gouache ideas or opaque painting ideas. So now I'm going to lay this on here. And then I'll pick up another color and plug it in there for these lighter purples, or I could come in and bleed some of the water out. Now notice it damages the surface of the paper. Can you see how the paper rises up and you get that kind of little speckled effect? And that's really the paper being damaged. You can see it here where you get that kind of grainy effect. You can see it here. You can see it where I corrected here. And it's actually pulling up the pulp of the paper and doing damage. I don't mind that at all because it creates an interesting surface, and I like to ruin things. No, it's just, I like that textural difference. So notice I can come in and soften these. So now I'm going to drag out some of the medium, wiping off, loading up, making sure I'm not getting too much water on that. Okay. Now in general, I'm going to use the rule of thumb. Every time I change the value, I want to change the temperature. So I made those a little bit bluer. Now I'm going to start coming in much more opaque. And when you squeeze out your tubes, notice that when I hit the top of that white, it resists, almost like it has a skin. It doesn't. It's still wet, but it's just very thick. Other times you squeeze it out, and gum arabic is the medium they use on this gouache. You'll get the medium, the gum arabic, flooding out, or an oil paint, you'll get the linseed oil flooding out, and it's very, very wet. So you never know how wet or dry that paint's going to come out. So you want to be very careful to get it the consistency that you want, and you're only going to find that consistency after doing a bunch of paintings. You'll find what works for you. So now I'm going to make a lighter blue, but I'm going to mix it out of the white rather than just glazing over the page, and you'll see the difference between using a watercolor technique and basically an acrylic technique here, since that's what it looks like. It actually has much more intensity than acrylic, but that's more or less what we got. Now the other problem with gouache is, now watch. See what's happening there? See, as it dries, it gets darker. When you start working with opaque gouache, it's very tricky at first, because you put that on, you say it's way too light, and then it will darken a little bit as it goes. So you need to kind of figure it out. You're over here on the palette making a wet version, and then you have to wait for it to dry. And let's just do that. And you can see now it's getting fairly close to value. Still a little light, but closer as it dries. Okay? So we want to make sure that we've got that right value. So gouache, some people don't like gouache at all just because of that, because it's tough. But what will happen is you'll end up after a while mixing several pots of color for your rosy cheeks, your red lips, your pale flesh, your brown hair, your green eyes, whatever. And then you'll have those pots of color that you can refer to, and that's the value I want. Even though this is dried now, I know it was the lighter version when it was wet, or vice versa, and it works in there. All right, so anyway, let's go ahead and pick up then some of this. So my general strategy here is lay down a shape or wash of color, and then come back with a wet brush to soften the edge where it needs to be softened. Okay, so let's see what those do when they dry. They almost disappear wet. And they show up a little stronger when they're dry, don't they? So I'm going to make an even darker version. I'm going to use some black into that purple. I'm going to use this red because it's a darker red than that a little bit. And I'll do it again. Now it disappeared completely now that it's dry. So interesting. Okay. And general rule of still life painting and landscape painting. In a still life, if I've got an egg, I'll put a dark shadow underneath the egg and then a dark accent in the shadow, and that'll help give it a weight. It anchors it down. Yeah, that's what I'm doing with these trees here. Just kind of anchoring them into the ground there. So we could just stop there for a little sketch like this, or we can come back and say, well, what would happen if I brought this in opaquely? Well, that's a little too light now, but it's going to dry. Let's see what happens when it dries. So we'll bring that down. Maybe I want to refine the branch structures. Maybe I want this to have a little bit better. There you can see the difference, wet to dry. Also, these things, the brush is getting thinner and thinner in paint, so these aren't going to be very opaque. Now this is much more transparent sky, painted sky over here than it was over there. So I'll reload. So I can get there. And this I'm going to actually wash off, lose the edge there, and then I'll let this pick up. In here. Okay, and then we have to wait patiently to see it dry. All right, so you can see as this stuff is dried, it comes and goes in its value range, as I said, generally gets a little bit darker as it dries. So every once in a while it'll get a little bit lighter when it dries too. But generally it gets a little bit darker. And you can see the finish here, and that would be all I'd do for a little study. Oftentimes I'll do a big study like this, or relatively large, and I'll come down here and I'll do something even simpler, because I've gotten fussy in this, and ended up, but the renderer in me will come out and I'll start noodling around on branches and pine cones and things like that. And so I want to clean it up, and so I work it out here, and I come here, get cleaner color, simpler design, cleaner execution, move on. All right, so we're going to do this little study of one of my daughters, actually. And then, as I said, this is our introductory bit on this. So we'll do some more careful renderings another time, but we want to just kind of get the basic idea of our stuff here, our medium and materials. And that's the way to learn the materials too, is don't try and do a photorealistic or really ambitious rendering. Do something that's just simple. Take a little bit of pressure off yourself, get to know the medium. Okay. I'm just going to work this out. Generally, I'm doing a very linear drawing, and for the forearm, for example, and I'm thinking of those balls, boxes, and tubes, that kind of construction. But I'm just laying it in a little flatter. I can correct it a little bit in my my painting. I can even draw back over it if the drawing gets out of control or something like that. So we're just wanting to get the basic stuff down, so I can lay in my shapes of color and get those shapes of color to harmonize. That shadow goes way back behind her. I'm going to have it come to the side because that's more interesting. All right, now this is going to be a little vignette, so I'm not going to bother to frame it. I'll just kind of render it and let it fade out. That's what the vignette means.